Hi everybody, welcome to the webinar. My name is Brett.Loveday and I'm going to be your presenter today. Today's topic is all about virtual desktops. I'm going to be going into great detail, to show you how to deliver virtual desktops cheaper than rolling out PCs. First of all, guys, I just want to thank you for taking the time out to attend this webinar today. I do really hope that you find it useful, and at the very least we give you a fresh perspective on some old problems. But first off, there's a couple of house rules. First being, this beginning bit of this webinar is actually pre-recorded, so we'll be running through this end to end. And the reason we've done that is because we've got so much to cover in such a short period of time. I've allocated 1 hour for this presentation, but I'd like to leave a little bit of room at the end for some questions and answers. Accompanying this presentation, there is a much more detailed white paper that you can download in the link in the presentation. But rest assured, guys, I am here. Will be in the chat window, and I will be answering questions. But if you have any burning questions, please put them in the chat window. And as you can see, my contact details are there in this slide here now. And this webinar will be recorded, so there's no need to take notes. So you'll get a copy of this webinar afterwards, and you get a copy of the white paper and a copy of this presentation as well. Right, before I start, I just need to talk a little bit about ThinTech. If you haven't heard of us, we are a consultancy company that specialises in Citrix technology. We've been around since 2006, and we have rolled out hundreds of thousands of desktops to date to some of the largest businesses in the UK. We've been instrumental in achieving some of the huge cost savings to many organisations, and I say that not to impress you, but I say that to impress upon you the impact that this can have to any size organisation, but only if it's done right. We also want to point out that ThinTech as a company has its own hosted desktops as a service, which has many thousands of users on it. And these concepts I'm going to be explaining to you today is exactly what I use in my own data centre, which gives us a real competitive edge. We sell hosted Citrix desktops with a Windows desktop with your applications, Microsoft Office 365, Azure, single sign-on, backup, antivirus, 24/7 help desk, disaster recovery, and a 99.9% uptime SLA for £37.50 per month per user. There is no way we could do that for that price if we don't do it the way that I'm about to explain to you, because otherwise it works out too expensive. And just so you're aware that our nearest competitor that offers a service that is like for us is sold at £65 per month per user. Whenever we've gone head to head with another competitor, the feedback we get from the clients is, Brett, you have smashed it. We smashed it in terms of performance, and we smashed it in terms of price. And these are the things that we're going to be covering today, and it's this method that I want to be teaching you all about today. Now, before we move on, I do need to clarify, what is a virtual desktop? I know it sounds a really stupid question, but actually there's more complexity to this than people realise. When I look at a virtual desktop, I see multiple technologies. I see that a desktop to me is your desktop delivery piece, and then you've got your application delivery, you got your remote access, and then you've got the bit at the bottom there, which is the user personalization. Now, we won't be going into too much detail about that today because there will be a separate presentation about that, but I can assure you at this stage here that this is something that needs to be core and a fundamental part of your design, and it shouldn't be an afterthought, because when we start to talk through these different types of technologies,
you are realizing that you're running different types of operating systems. So if you don't think about that, how that's going to impact the users, then yeah, you're always going to hit trouble. So it should always form part and parcel of your basis of your conversation. So for this presentation, we're going to be concentrating on this box here, this desktop delivery piece here. And yeah, I'm going to explain the different types of desktops that exist, because there isn't just one type of desktop. So I apologize for the guys that already know this, but I think it's really important that I get this across, because yeah, you'll see why in a moment, that sometimes we find that terminology can get mixed up. So, but basically there are two types of desktops that you can deliver as a virtual desktop. Now, one of them is called a VDI desktop, and the other one is called a server-based computing, or SBC for short, desktop. And the difference between them is quite simple. A VDI desktop is where you're running Microsoft Windows 10 on some tin that's not on their laptop, and that could be most likely in your data center on some high-end server equipment, and you're going to be running multiple copies of Windows 10 off the same kit. So the compute power that you need to run Windows 10 doesn't change. It's just that you're shifting it away from the device and you're putting it onto a high-end server in the back end. With server-based computing, it is slightly different. This time you're not running Windows 10. This time you're going to be running a Windows Server operating system, typically Windows Server 2016 or Windows Server 2019. And on these servers, you're going to allow users to log onto these servers, and each user gets a session on the server. Rather than getting the full operating system to themselves, they get a session on a server, and you can have multiple sessions logging onto the same server. Now I'm going to have to say, guys, I find that the terminology VDI and server-based computing is sometimes confused, sometimes mixed up. It's quite often we come across clients where they're talking to me about VDI when realistically they're not using VDI, they're using server-based computing. And yeah, so we've often find the terminology does get confusing, and so what we've decided to do is stop using industry terminology, and we come up with our own terminology that we feel that makes much more sense. So for the purpose of this presentation here, when we're talking about VDI desktop, we're talking what we call a virtual PC desktop. And we call it a virtual PC desktop because really that's exactly what it is. It's a virtual PC and it's your desktop. And there are different types of those desktops, but we'll come back to those in a moment. And if you're using server-based computing, we rename that to server session desktops. For the obvious reason, because you're not really running a desktop, you're logged onto a session on a server. So I hope that makes sense, guys. So session-based desktops means that you're logged onto a Windows Server operating system. Virtual PC desktops, you're running a copy of Windows 10. Now the VDI or virtual PC desktop can come in two flavors really, and one of them is what we call a pooled desktop, and the other one is called a private desktop. And the difference between the two is that with a pooled desktop, it's quite neat. You create one master image and you have one hard drive, and then you can duplicate that as many times as you want. So you would typically use a provisioning tool, either Machine Creation Services or Citrix Provisioning Services, and you are delivering a read-only desktop that all comes from that one master image. Now that's really handy for many reasons, because you've got one set of administration for all of your desktops, and you've got so you have one image, and typically that image is read-only. So if you need to update that image, you simply update the master image, and the next time that people log on, they will get that update as well. And another really neat feature about a pooled desktop is it is typically deployed in read-only format. I mean, this is great from a security point of view, because if this desktop become infected, just log off, it reboots, and then you get a new brand new Windows Server desktop. You get a brand new Windows desktop every time you log in. It's a bit like doing a factory reset every time you log off. You won't have any say in what machine you connect into. It'll be sitting there with a random pool of what we call non-persistent desktops, and anything that's unique to you will be stored within your user profile. Now, a private desktop is the opposite of that. A private desktop is where you have an individual hard drive for each virtual PC desktop that you deploy. And there was a need for that, and I'll explain that a little bit later. But a private desktop is where you allocate the hard drive to the virtual copy of Windows 10. And for each copy of Windows 10, they will each have their own hard drive. But obviously, desktop's great, but desktop is nothing without its applications. And there's a separate paper coming out very soon that talks about the application delivery method into your virtual desktops. But the goal here is that we try to get as few as possible applications stored into your master image to keep it nice and clean and consistent. And there are other technologies of getting the applications into the desktop on a per user basis, on an as and when needed basis, rather than installing it into the core image. We'll be touching on remote access today, and I'll be focusing around NetScaler and how we do that with that. And finally, there's a piece around user personalization, and we will not be going into too much detail with that today, but reach out to me if you do have any profile concerns or issues. We have got the perfect solution for you. We are the author and creator of the open source tool called TPMM, which is a vendor agnostic profile management solution. Now, to make sense of all these things that I've said here, I need to put each different type of desktop into its context, and the best way I can do that would be to talk about the use cases of what desktop is right for each different type of use case. So these next sets of slides, we'll be talking all about the different use cases. In this slide, we're going to be talking about server session desktops. And just to remind you, a server session desktop is where a user logs onto a Windows Server operating system, Windows Server 2016 or 2019, and they get a session on that server. And they'll be sharing that resource. There'll be other users logged onto the same server with their own session, but they won't know. Okay? But typically, this type of desktop is given to users that have no admin rights at all. They've got no way to change the back end. It's very locked down. They can't install any software. But the most important thing with this desktop, it must perform. And it must work from any device. And it must be reliable and fast and performant. So like I said, this would be a Windows 10 look and feel desktop. But it's not obviously a Windows 10, it's Windows Server 2016. And yeah, as long as it performs, most people will be very happy with this type of desktop. Now, for virtual PC desktops, and we talk about each one separately, for pooled virtual PC desktop, this is where you're running copies of Windows 10 on equipment in your data center, delivered back to the users, typically using Citrix technology. And this is a full-blown copy of Windows 10. It comes from one master image, and typically you deliver hundreds, if not thousands, of desktops from one single hard drive. For this type of desktop, we would have found that this would be, it would be fine. That it would have been fine for users on the previous desktop, the server session desktop, and they would be quite happy on that type of desktop. But they can't, because there'd be something quirky that we're just unable to get working on a server operating system. And we've come across a few oddities in our life. And so an example I would give you would be that for whatever reasons, we cannot get the interactive whiteboards working in the classrooms, in the schools, on session-based desktops. But for them, a pooled virtual PC desktop is perfectly fine for them. So to recap, it would be somebody that would quite happily have sat on a server session desktop, but they can't, and it'd be for some very obscure reason. There is a need for that type of desktop, but it's very niche. Now for a private desktop, we do see more of a use case for that than we do over pooled desktops. Now it's odd. I see a lot of the industry is quite heavily pushing pooled desktop as being the main type of desktop for most of your users. And if you've come on this journey so far, you may have come across that same conclusion. And I can tell you now, you will not be able to do that cheaper than rolling out PCs. So just keep that thought in mind. But a private desktop is where you've got a one-to-one relationship with the virtual PC desktop. Each one has their own hard drive, and you're going to give those to your power users, somebody that needs way in excess of the average compute power required that you're going to give them on a session-based desktop. And it's going to be your CAD users, the CAM users, it's going to be high-end users, your developers, your IT administrators. These guys, they're going to want to be able to install their own software, and they want to make changes to the system themselves. So having a private hard drive allows them to do those sorts of things. So if you've got any user that needs any local administration rights, they want to be able to install their own software, or they're really high-end users, a private desktop is probably the easiest and cheapest way of doing that. I'm going to let you into a little secret, guys, because the difference between a virtual PC desktop and a server session desktop, if done right, is actually indistinguishable. Your users will be quite happy on a server session desktop, blissfully unaware that they're logged on to the same system with other users at the same time. They have got absolutely no way of knowing that they are sharing that server operating system with other users. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a minute, because there's a couple of tricks that we've got up our sleeve to make that even easier from the user's point of view. The first trick we do is we get rid of the vendor logos. Citrix have a habit of putting a logo over flipping everything. So whenever there's a problem, guess what they say? There's a Citrix problem. And it's never a Citrix problem. It's the file server, it's the main controller, but Citrix gets the blame for everything. But take that logo away. Secondly, because they're logging onto a server operating system, when you do things like Control-Alt-Delete and lock the screen, it's pretty evident that you're on Windows Server OS over, say, like a Windows 10 OS, because it's got the logo there. So again, there's a couple of hacks that we've got here that can actually remove those, and so the users don't really get to see that. And thirdly, we just remove access to the task manager, so it's impossible for the users to tell that there were other users on at the same time. They just were blissfully unaware. And to put this to the test, I'm actually going to duck out of this presentation that I've got here, and I'm going to show you a session-based desktop for real. This is a live demo into our own environment, and I'm going to show you some of the neat features, and I'm going to show you why we use Citrix over any other technology.
So what we're looking at here is, I'm logged in remotely. I'm actually working from home today, so I just go to a remote site and I get presented to a desktop here, and I'm going to log into this. Need to pray to the gods.
Hopefully this goes okay. It'll be fine. We done it. I'm confident. So just to explain what we're looking at here, as we mentioned just now, this is what we call a server session desktop. Now this type of desktop really, like I said before, it's completely locked down. We've gone to great lengths to make it look identical to Windows 10. In fact, if you run the two side by side, you will not be able to tell the difference. And as I said earlier, just remove the logos. Citrix just put their logo on everything. Microsoft put their logo on everything. So, yeah. So I said earlier, you disable access to this task manager. So I'm actually logged on to this system with other users, and there'll be, there's no way of me knowing that there are other users logged on at the same time. And when I do things like Control-Alt-Delete to bring up the screen, you can see I've even removed the Windows Server logo, and we won't be going into detail to do that today, but just message me, and it's very simple how to do that, and I'll tell you how to do that over a private message. These are running the latest versions of Citrix, and like I say, it's session based, and an important thing with this is it just needs to perform. You need to open up Word, and it needs to be nice and responsive, and it does exactly. You get no type of delay. It's really quick, and this is me working from home on my broadband connection in a data center that's a good 100 miles away from me. Everything I need is on here. It supports Skype for business. It's got support Teams, which is probably already running, which is probably down here. Yeah, Teams is there, and we do full Teams integration. We do full Skype for business integration. There we go. And if you do the Microsoft Office 365 piece right, you can basically single sign on as well. And this is set up for single sign on for Office 365. So this is running click to run version of Office 365, and it will automatically per user registration. And while we're here, we might just show some of the neat features now on the new versions of Citrix. So let's try and do something bold. Let's go to YouTube, for example. One of the things that I wanted to show you is this thing here over here is called browser content redirection. You see that slight lag there? I'll explain that in a moment, but that lag is quite important because what it's doing is it's caching it on my device, this browser content redirection will redirect any website that we tell it to run locally on the client. And when I say locally on the client, it actually runs on the Chromium browser built into the receiver on the client. And so whatever I choose to run here now won't be running on the server, and it will run at the same speed as if it was running locally, and it just overlays it back. So any Dragon Ball Z fans out there? Let's have a look at this SpaceX one here. So you can see we get absolutely zero lag, zero delay. It's a little bit noisy. I might turn it down, bear with me. We get absolutely no lag or delay or anything. This runs just as fast as if you're running it locally here, and we can actually run it full screen. There we go. Yeah. Now, if we want to be really brave, I could put a 4K video up. So let's keep do a search for 4K. Typing in the wrong blinking place. Okay, so we're going to look at random one. This is a 4K video. Sorry about the piece advert, right? And here we go, all the things about YouTube is going to try. So this is a full, let's run it full screen, full 4K video, running at 60 frames per second on a virtual desktop hosted in a data center a good 100 miles away from me. So just this one small demo. We can whitelist any site. So for example, if you're running Teams meetings or you're running Zoom meetings or any GoToMeeting, we can whitelist all of those as well. So any online webinars and presentations can also be done on here as well. So this, guys, is a server session desktop. Now, when we combine all this together, guys, I can say with absolute confidence, hand on heart, that I know that over 95% of your user base are going to be quite happily sitting in this server session desktop space. And we have got clients actually over, well, close to 100% actually. And with the combination of virtual PC desktops, whether it's pooled or private, that the remaining 5% can be mopped up in one means or another. So I can say to Matt, no matter how challenging you think your desktop is, I can give you a solution that will work with you. And so on the basis of that, I know that, and we've done this with many clients, that we've effectively managed to get 100% of the user estate quite effectively working as a virtual desktop. And that brings in all sorts of potential strategic options for you guys, because if we've got 100% of your user base working neatly, tidily, securely in your data center, then the rest of your network could just be an open cloud. And we'll explain that in a minute. But if everything that the users need to do, their desktops, their applications, the remote and offline capability, and their personalization piece at the bottom is nice and secure in your data center, then this is where you can start thinking, hang on a minute, this could be strategic. And you're going to start applying some sort of strategic metrics to that. And the most obvious one that comes to mind is things like BYO. Bring your own device into work. Allow users to use their own device, turn up at your work, and then, you don't care on the end state of that, because none of that is really going to touch your core network. You become an IT service provider that provides a service, and the endpoint becomes almost completely irrelevant. And just on the subject of BYO, guys, I just want to point out my view on this, because for me, BYO isn't about BYO. BYO is about you putting 100% of your desktops, your applications, nice and secure in your data center, and then you provide only one means of being able to get access to that. And if the only way that you can get access to those core services is via two firewalls with a DMZ and NetScaler sitting in that DMZ, and that will relay the traffic through into there, that means that you only need to open up port 443 to the external interface here, and the NetScaler does all of the clever stuff. You can put it back through another firewall, you can unencrypt it from that point onwards, and you can do stateful packet inspection and intrusion detection as well. So this really brings in a high level of security. If the only way that you can access these virtual desktops, whether you're an internal user or an external user, this is the only way to do it, guys. And so it's that becomes key, because if you get this piece right, the rest of your network just becomes really, really simplistic. You just have an open cloud. Open cloud, allow anybody to come in with only any device, knowing that even if somebody turns up with a virus-riddled laptop, there is no way that that machine has got direct and access to your data center, and you're protected. And I have seen it on occasion. I've seen virus-riddled laptops turn up and connect into virtual desktops, but there's no mechanism for any worms or trojans to traverse this to get access to your data center. And it's this that enables BYO and not the other way around. And so if you're looking at BYO, you really should look at NetScalers, and you should really look at the way that users access the virtual desktops, and you should lock it down in this particular way.
Right, guys, so we've got the basics out of the way, and now we can concentrate on the stuff that's important. So now we're going to start talking about what is core to this presentation. This slide here shows the amount of resource that you need to allocate per user in order to guarantee a fast performing desktop. And please remember, guys, that we've been doing this for many years now, and we've rolled out hundreds of thousands of desktops, and we have tested hundreds of different variations. And these metrics here are a culmination of many years of research. But actually, I will backphrase that slightly. These are our current metrics. What we're finding is with each iteration of Windows, we do need to adjust these metrics slightly. But one of the biggest changes that we've made recently is been a sharp increase in the amount of IOPS that we allocate per user. And the main reason behind that is simply because of Outlook cache mode. Believe it or not, we used to budget 7.2 IOPS per user session 2 years ago. Today, we now need to budget 100 IOPS. And the reason being, the moment you enable cache mode in Microsoft Outlook, your disk IOPS would jump to an average around about 100 per user session, even when you're using smart technology like FS Logics. If you run in Office 365, there's a high probability that you're either planning to or already have moved your Exchange box off-premise and moved it to Exchange Online. And if you have done that, or you plan to do that, you have no choice but to run Outlook in cache mode. If you don't run Outlook in cache mode, you can't search. And every time the user logs on, it would have to pull down their entire inbox, and it would just be awful for the users. But we'll come back to that. So we'll just start off with these metrics here. So 800 megs of addressable memory space per user session does not sound like very much. But bear in mind, there are two other components to factor here. One is that we need to allocate 4 gigabytes of RAM for the base OS, plus the 800 megs of addressable memory space per user, plus we've got paging. And the user has the addressable memory space of the entire session server. So we use these numbers as a guideline and not as a defined metric. So as long as when we allocate users to the system that we know there is enough memory available to support them. And it's the same for CPU as well. CPU, we work on a basis that you should never have more than a 6:1 ratio, user ratio on the CPU core count. So for example, if you've got two 12-core processors with hyperthreading enabled, that will give you 48 cores presented into the hypervisor. On the basis that you don't want to oversubscribe these more than 6:1. So a 6:1 user ratio per CPU core means that you could have 6 users per core. And with 48 cores, would give you a maximum possible permutations of 288 users per physical host. And bear in mind, that is the top limit. And as we mentioned earlier, the disk IOPS should never be underestimated. Pretty much in 99 out of the 100 Citrix support performance issues that we deal with, disk IOPS is the problem. No one really fully understands the I/O requirements for virtual PC desktops and virtual session desktops. They don't realize it's so extreme. And when you think about this, I mean, if you run a laptop that's probably got an SSD attached to it, then imagine if you've got to run 1,000 of those. You need a lot of disk IOPS. So in a nutshell, we see that by at least a factor of 10, that the disk speed becomes one of the biggest bottlenecks and limiting factors that will affect the number of users that you can get per box. And I would do my best to put it into perspective, but 100 IOPS doesn't sound like much, but trust me, that is a very high number. A top of the range 15K SAS drive, enterprise grade, would give you 180 IOPS for one drive. So you can see easily how disk performance can be a huge bottleneck. What's not shown here, and it's worth discussing here, is the logon time. One of the most intensive things you can do with Citrix or terminal services is to log on. Logging on is one of the most CPU, memory, but more importantly I/O intensive things that you can do. And at its peak, at logon, we often see IOPS in excess of 200 per user. And early in the morning, when everybody's logging on, you could have hundreds all trying to log on at the same time, and that's what we call the logon storm. So one really important thing to do here is to make sure you've got a good profile management solution, and making sure that the logon time is as quick as it possibly can be, because the longer the logon, the longer the system is under strain. So I ask you guys just to make notes of these metrics, and we'll come back to these later. So it's 800 megs of addressable memory space per user. It's no more than 6:1 ratio per CPU core, so and 100 disk IOPS per user. And if you do this, guys, if you allocate this resource to this user, I am guaranteeing you that you are going to give him a fast performing desktop. In the next slide, we're going to be looking at what does that look like from a session server perspective. How much resource do we allocate to the session servers?
Now, one of the first advice we give to customers that when it comes to desktop virtualization, we do not recommend that you run this on the same core infrastructure that you've got the rest of your compute. Desktop virtualization requires such a unique set of hardware requirements that we recommend that you buy servers for the purpose for what they're needed. And in here you can see that we are preferencing Dell R640 here. I'm stating just openly honestly here that I prefer Dell R640s because if I'm spending my money, that's exactly what I'm going to buy. And if I don't believe in it myself, I'm not going to recommend it. I can tell you now, the Dell R640s are powerful bits of kit. And when we look at these and compare them against other vendors, we cannot get the same specification for the same price. It's as simple as that. So the equivalent in obviously HP with Dell R360, they do come in slightly lower spec CPUs. We can't match them exactly, but fundamentally they're all going to have the same kit inside of them. You open them up, it's going to have Intel chip, Intel motherboard, Intel. So, but the key one here is this 960 gig MLC write intensive SSDs that gives us 120,000 IOPS per box. And if you was to do this with HP, you will find that you will spend on average about £4,000 more per server for basically a slightly less specification. So again, likewise, I'm talking from heart here, saying if it's my money I'm spending, this is what I'm buying. Okay, guys, so the key one here is these local SSD storage. What we do recommend on these boxes here, these boxes are just been allocated and provisioned just for the provision of the desktops and nothing else. We're not going to connect them to the SAN. We're going to leverage the local SSDs to move off all of those IOPS requirements onto the local SSD drives, and on average we get about 120,000 IOPS per server. And obviously if you're going to get new servers, you're going to put 10 gig networking in here. So the average cost for each of these servers is about £10,000 each. And if you can get an average of 280 users on these boxes, you can see this is where it starts becoming cost effective, because if you do the maths, that works out at £36 per user in physical hardware costs to deliver a desktop. And bear in mind that £36 is going to be over 5 years too. So that's very cost effective. The industry average, by the way, is 120. We've got that right down to £36. Yeah, I just want to point out a couple more things here, guys. So this 12 core processors here, so we recommend it 2 12 core processors, which would give you 48 cores with hyperthreading, is the optimum number here, because if you start going above that, what that's all that's going to do is increase your Microsoft Server licensing costs. So we don't recommend you go above 12 cores here, because if you do, you're just going to be wasting money, because you're going to pay for Microsoft Windows Server licenses and you're not likely to get any more users off these boxes. So we found again 12 cores to be an absolute optimum figure as well. And secondly, when it comes to the hypervisors for this, we do highly recommend Citrix Zen Server. Citrix Zen Server, if you don't fully understand technology, is the hypervisor for Citrix Zen Server is completely different from VMware. VMware, praise it up here. I'm a huge fan of VMware. It's my favorite hypervisor. You know, there's nothing out there that can touch that. I'm a VCP myself, and I'm a big fan of the technology. But with Zen Server, the hypervisor is actually built into the CPU, and so what you get with Zen Server is almost bare metal performance. I call it a Type 0 hypervisor. When you install a VM and you install the Zen tools into it, the VMs that are using that talk directly to the hardware. They're not going via the hypervisor, they talk directly to the hypervisor, so you're getting the best possible performance. And you know, just to state openly here, you know, it's not a sophisticated VMware, on the basis that you know, it doesn't lend itself to ballooning and you can't oversubscribe CPUs. But the reality is you don't really want to do that either, because when you're running virtual desktops on a virtual platform, stuff gets lost in translation. And yeah, and when you're creating these virtual desktops, you want to make sure that there's a one-to-one affinity. So you don't want to be sharing resources. You don't want to be oversubscribing the resources. So when you say you create a session server and you allocate it 32 gigs of RAM and 6 virtual CPUs and this amount of hard drive space, that is dedicated to that machine. Yeah, you're not sharing it with anything else. And it's that, again, within this design is really, really critical, because you're pretty much guaranteeing the performance again. And another key thing is that Zen Server is completely free. When you buy the Citrix licenses, you get Zen Server with it, and I highly recommend that. Zen Server is the best platform. If you're going to run Citrix, you're going to want to run a Citrix hypervisor underneath. And if you put VMware on it, what we found is, on average, that we get a 40% degradation in the number of users that we can get per box. And you're going to have to pay for the VMware licenses as well. So stick to Zen Server, guys. Yeah, guys, just a couple of more points I want to point out onto this as well, because it's also really, really important. So the desktop that we're going to be delivering to these bits of kit here are going to be provisioned as read-only. So these boxes we're just using as raw horsepower. There is absolutely nothing to back up on them. Okay, so these boxes, we just want them for the raw horsepower. Now, the bits that are important to Citrix, we do actually want on your other hypervisor. So Director, Studio, Storefront, NetScaler, File Services, you name it. We want that protected on your core existing VMware Hyper-V infrastructure, and we want these boxes dedicated just purely for the raw horsepower and the power they can give us to deliver the fastest performing desktop. And like I said, these desktops are read-only, and so there is absolutely nothing to back up on them.
So guys, now we've got these bits of kit. What is the best way to carve them up? Yeah, there are various ways to carve them up, and this graph here shows the possible permutations in the way that the few possible permutations that we've tested on, and I just want to go through them in a little bit of detail here. So there's quite a bit of detail in this slide here, so I'll do my best to explain it. But basically, if you've got a box that's got 256 gigs of RAM, it's got two 12-core processors, and it's got 960 gigs of local SSD drives. So there are various ways to carve them up, and we didn't know what was the best way to carve them up. You know, would it be better to say, for example, run lots of low-end session servers, and see how many users we can get in them, or do we go for a smaller number of really high-end session servers to see how many we can get off them? So these charts here just demonstrates the permutations of that we've checked, and we've got all the data here, and we've run all of these tests. And so we've taken one physical Dell R6030 server, and we've carved it up in various ways. And so, jumping ahead of here. So yeah, and as you can see, if we went really low end, guys, if we went 2 virtual CPUs, 16 gigs of RAM, we found that we could get 16 session servers on them that consumed pretty much most of the CPU, but actually total of 32 CPUs there, and it consumed all 256 gigs of RAM. We looked at other options with 2 virtual CPUs and 24 gigs of RAM, 6 virtual CPUs, 32 gigs of RAM, 8 virtual CPUs, 40 gigs of RAM, 10 virtual CPUs and 48 gigs of RAM. And then we did some tests, and we said, how many desktops could we get on these possible permutations? Because each of these setups will consume all of the hardware. So there's some interesting stuff that comes out the back of this.
So guys, this is where it starts to get really, really, really interesting now, because we noticed some oddities when we was running our tests here. Something bizarre within this, but you would think that the more resources that you throw at a session server, the more session servers that you'll be able to get off one box. But we found that was not true, actually. We found an oddity that there is not a linear growth. There was not a linear growth in the number of users that you get per session server based on the specification. So let's just look at this. The box that we allocated the lowest possible resources, lo and behold, we were lucky to get 10 or 11 users off that. So 2 virtual CPUs and 16 gigs of RAM. So no surprise there. So when we went to 4 virtual CPUs and we put 24 gigs of RAM, we got 22. That's not bad. And then when we went to 6 virtual CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM, that was pretty good. We had a nice quick jump up there. But then when we got to 8 virtual CPUs and 40 gigs of RAM, and it didn't really matter about the RAM, to be perfectly honest with you, we still were not getting a linear growth. In fact, it sort of peaked out around about 40 users before we start seeing degradation. And if we really ramped it up to 10 virtual CPUs and 48 cores, again, such a small gain in improvement. So what we found is this 6 virtual CPU, 32 gigs of RAM seemed to be the really sweet spot here. And if you increase the RAM, and it doesn't matter how much you increase the RAM, you don't get a linear increase. And if you reduce the RAM slightly or whatever, you get quite a large drop in number of users. So of the tests that we've done across all these possible permutations, there may be other tests to do, but we found that our standard build today is for 6 virtual CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM, because that is the optimum. So guys, working on a basis that we don't want to oversubscribe the hardware, and looking at the possible permutations of the different type of specifications that we allocate to each session server, we can see here that if we went for the lowest end virtual machine, 2 virtual CPUs, 16 cores, we could get up to 16 of those. And if we went for the higher end, we'd be lucky to get 5 of those off one box. Now the box that we're saying is quite important here is this 6 virtual CPUs here, and yeah, we're able to get 8 of those running off one single Dell R630 server. Now this won't make sense until we start looking at the other slides here. Yeah, so guys, if we look at this, we know that we can get an average around about 35 user sessions on a 6 virtual CPU core with 32 gigs of RAM. That gives us a maximum capacity of 280 users of one of those bog standard Dell servers, the R640s. Apologies, I said 630 earlier, but 640s. We're able to get 280 desktops. All the other possible permutations will reduce the number of users you can get, and this whole presentation is about delivering the most cost-effective virtual desktop solution. So that gives you evidence to say why we use 6 virtual CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM. So when we look at this and we looked at all the possible permutations, we found that if you run 8 copies of Windows Server 2016 or 2019 with 6 virtual CPUs and 32 gigs of RAM, we're able to get 8 of those running off one box, which gives us a capacity of around about 280 users. And if you translate that back down to monetary value, that gives you the lowest cost to deliver in virtual desktops. The cost in hardware is £35.71 per user over a 5-year period, because you're going to buy these servers, you're going to depreciate them over 5 years, and you're going to get 5 years warranty with them. So that is unheard of. The industry average is £120. So yeah.
Now we've seen what the hardware looks like and how we carve it up and how much it costs us, we now need to do a comparison how much this compares to rolling out PCs and laptops. And the easiest way for me to do that is to look at the total cost of ownership of what it would cost you if you was to roll out PCs and laptops. And for the simplistic of calculations, I'm basing it off 1,000 users. And I'm doing it 1,000 users because it's easy and I'm lazy. Now I'm just going to state here that I am going to make a few assumptions, and those assumptions I'm going to state here. And the first assumption is that we expect that the average cost of a PC or a laptop to be around about £500. Now I actually think that's quite generous, and we find that some companies are spending way more than that. And the second assumption is that the cost of support per user per year is around about £100 per user per year. And that's typically made up by the cost of your IT staff for the duration of the year, and divide that by the number of users. And I can tell you now that £100 is actually also very generous, and the true figure would be closer to somewhere to £300 to £400. But it's a start. And even on these generous figures, you're going to see in a minute that we can actually still beat these figures. So let's look at it this way. So if you went out and bought 1,000 PCs for 1,000 staff, you will have an initial CapEx expenditure. When I say CapEx, I mean that's capital expenditure. It goes into the balance sheet of the business. They're assets that's owned by the business. But you will spend £500,000 on 1,000 devices. Now, we all know that's not the full cost. So with this, you're going to have annual operational costs. And these numbers here, they put you in the centre here. We're saying there's £100 per user in support costs per year. There's a depreciation of the hardware. And I'm basing it that you're going to depreciate these 20% year in, year out. So these PCs are going to last you 5 years. Now, I know some organisations make them last way longer than that, and I know loads of organisations that are lucky to get 3 years out of them. But this is a good starting point, and 20% is a good figure. So when you add that together, there's a £200,000 additional fees each year to manage the 1,000 desktops and PCs and laptops. And so because the total cost of ownership is going to be done over 5 years, we actually have to take that number and times it by 5, which gives us a £1 million operational cost over 5 years to manage 1,000 desktops. And then you add that together with your initial CapEx cost, you'd end up with a spend of 1.5 million to service 1,000 users with PCs and laptops over 5 years. And it's these figures that I'm going to form as the baseline for the comparison of virtual desktops. I'm just going to pause this page for a moment so you could just absorb these numbers. Now, if we compare this to what this looks like for virtual desktops, and we attempt to do a total cost of ownership calculation of virtual desktops, and as you can see, there will be lots of other items that we need to factor into the costing, and so we need to go through them line by line just so they all make sense. And just like rolling out PCs and laptops, you're going to have a CapEx cost and you're going to have an OpEx cost. So if we start off with the CapEx costs, we know that based on what we spoke about earlier, that you're going to get on average 200 to 280 users or 280 desktops off one of those Dell R640 servers. We suggested that 6 servers should be ample capacity. And the reason we suggest 6 and not 5 is because you always need to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room and expect failure. So this is an N+1 design model, where one of the servers could completely fail, but or you could still continue to service all your users. And also, it just makes maintenance a lot easier as well. If you've got spare swing kit, you can move servers off from one machine to another while you do maintenance on the others. And like I said, those servers are about 10,000 each, so you need 6 of those. There's about £60,000 of server infrastructure required to support this. Now, setting up Citrix and all this properly is not easy, so more than likely you're going to have to get a consultancy company in like ThinkTech to set this all up for you and we estimate that to be around about the 45,000 mark. And then you've got the additional cost of the license procurement. We come back to Citrix, but as I said earlier, when it comes to Windows Server licenses, if you've got 12 core processors, each box will have 24 cores in total. And if you run Microsoft Data Center Edition, you need to buy 12 2-core license packs per server, because you need to license per core. And RDSH, or terminal server licenses, you're going to need a license for every user. They come in 2 flavors. You get a user license or you get a device license. And it's very rare that a device license works out right. It's mostly always a user license. So typically you're going to need a terminal server license for all users. And if we just quickly switch back to Citrix, there are so many variations of licensing, but if you're just wanting to run virtual desktops, then my recommendation is that you go to Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops, Advanced Edition, User/Device Licensing, based on a perpetual license and annual software maintenance. That is the most cost-effective way of rolling out Citrix. Citrix do have a concurrency licensing model, but they're more over 2 times more expensive. And when you're running virtual desktops, concurrency is basically out the window because everybody's pretty much logged on all the time. And yeah, a user device license is far cheaper than a concurrent license. And it saddens for me to report that quite often I see too many large organisations, especially councils, have been oversold their Citrix licensing. They've got platinum licenses and are not using a single platinum feature. They've got concurrent licenses and they're running virtual desktops. And I can tell you now, a concurrent platinum license will be over 4 times more expensive than a user device license on virtual apps and desktops. And bear in mind that license would also give you a license for a Zen server as well. So if we just go through the numbers then, so 1,000 Citrix licenses at roughly £135 a license, it's going to be 135,000 again, CapEx cost. You've got the Windows Server cows and you've got the terminal server licenses. And when you add in the consultancy as well, because that should be capitalized as well, then you're looking at an initial CapEx cost of just shy of 380,000, actually 376,000 to be precise. And already you can see that is cheaper than just rolling out PCs alone. So don't go and spend £500,000 on PCs. You can roll out virtual desktop cheaper than buying those PCs. Now, secondly, it's the annual OPEX cost. This is where it gets quite interesting. We said earlier that the best case scenario is that the cost of the support of your PCs is around about £100 per user per year. Now, that is very, very low. But even still, based on that low figure, we can still beat these numbers. So if we just go for these line by line. So for hardware depreciation, we're talking about the Dell servers here. Again, like the PCs, we expect you to depreciate these 20% year in, year out. So come year 5, these are end of life and should be replaced at the beginning of year 6. And then you've got the additional cost of the software maintenance that you won't have on a PC and laptop estate. And these include the software maintenance for Citrix and your server licenses and your terminal server licenses as well. And more than likely, you're going to need to outsource the third line support of this to, again, an organisation like ThinTech as well, because it wouldn't make sense for you to employ expensive Citrix people internally. It's far more cost effective to outsource that to a much larger team, actually. And the average cost of that is about $36,000 a year. And we've also factored in that at some point, your PCs that you're currently using which we do recommend we convert to DOM terminals, will eventually come end of life and just die anyway, and we expect around about a 20% replacement of those each year with dedicated devices like the WISE 3040 units. And we even added that into the calculation. So combined, you're looking at an annual operational cost of around about 167,000 a year to run virtual desktops. So the next slide will give us the total cost of ownership. Now, if we compare this to what this looks like for virtual desktops, and we attempt to do a total cost of ownership calculation of virtual desktops, and as you can see, there will be lots of other items that we need to factor into the costing, and so we need to go through them line by line just so they all make sense. And just like rolling out PCs and laptops, you're going to have a CapEx cost and you're going to have an OpEx cost. So if we start off with the CapEx costs, we know that based on what we spoke about earlier, that you're going to get on average 200 to 280 users or 280 desktops off one of those Dell R640 servers. We suggested that 6 servers should be ample capacity. And the reason we suggest 6 and not 5 is because you always need to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room and expect failure. So this is an N+1 design model, where one of the servers could completely fail, but or you could still continue to service all your users. And also, it just makes maintenance a lot easier as well. If you've got spare swing kit, you can move servers off from one machine to another while you do maintenance on the others. And like I said, those servers are about 10,000 each, so you need 6 of those. There's about £60,000 of server infrastructure required to support this. Now, setting up Citrix and all this properly is not easy, so more than likely you're going to have to get a consultancy company in like ThinkTech to set this all up for you, and we estimate that to be around about the 45,000 mark. And then you've got the additional cost of the license procurement. We come back to Citrix, but as I said earlier, when it comes to Windows Server licenses, if you've got 12 core processors, each box will have 24 cores in total. And if you run Microsoft Data Center Edition, you need to buy 12 2-core license packs per server, because you need to license per core. And RDSH, or terminal server licenses, you're going to need a license for every user. They come in 2 flavors. You get a user license or you get a device license. And it's very rare that a device license works out right. It's mostly always a user license. So typically you're going to need a terminal server license for all users. And if we just quickly switch back to Citrix, there are so many variations of licensing, but if you're just wanting to run virtual desktops, then my recommendation is that you go to Citrix Virtual Apps and Desktops, Advanced Edition, User/Device Licensing, based on a perpetual license and annual software maintenance. That is the most cost-effective way of rolling out Citrix. Citrix do have a concurrency licensing model, but they're more over 2 times more expensive. And when you're running virtual desktops, concurrency is basically out the window because everybody's pretty much logged on all the time, and a user device license is far cheaper than a concurrent license. And it's sad for me to report that quite often I see too many large organisations, especially councils, have been oversold their Citrix licensing. They've got platinum licenses and are not using a single platinum feature. They've got concurrent licenses and they're running virtual desktops. And I can tell you now, a concurrent platinum license will be over 4 times more expensive than a user device license on virtual apps and desktops. And bear in mind that license will also give you a license for a Zen server as well. So if we just go through the numbers then, so 1,000 Citrix licenses at roughly £135 a license, it's going to be 135,000 again, CapEx cost. You've got the Windows Server cows and you've got the terminal server licenses. And when you add in the consultancy as well, because that should be capitalized as well, then you're looking at an initial CapEx cost of just shy of 380,000, actually 376,000 to be precise. And already you can see that is cheaper than just rolling out PCs alone. So don't go and spend £500,000 on PCs. You can roll out virtual desktops cheaper than buying those PCs. Now, secondly, it's the annual OPEX cost. This is where it gets quite interesting. We said earlier that the best case scenario is that the cost of the support of your PCs is around about £100 per user per year. Now, that is very, very low. But even still, based on that low figure, we can still beat these numbers. So if we just go for these line by line. So for hardware depreciation, we're talking about the Dell servers here. Again, like the PCs, we expect you to depreciate these 20% year in, year out. So come year 5, these are end of life and should be replaced at the beginning of year 6. And then you've got the additional cost of the software maintenance that you won't have on a PC and laptop estate. And these include the software maintenance for Citrix and your server licenses and your terminal server licenses as well. And more than likely, you're going to need to outsource the third line support with this to, again, an organisation like ThinTech as well, because it wouldn't make sense for you to employ expensive Citrix people internally. It's far more cost effective to outsource that to a much larger team, actually. And the average cost of that is about $36,000 a year. And we've also factored in that at some point, your PCs that you're currently using, which we do recommend we convert to DOM terminals, will eventually come end of life and just die anyway. And we expect around about a 20% replacement of those each year with dedicated devices like the WISE 3040 units. And we even added that into the calculation. So combined, you're looking at an annual operational cost of around about $167,000 a year to run virtual desktops. So the next slide will give us the total cost of ownership. So there you have it, guys. The total cost of ownership for virtual desktops is $1.2 million for 1,000 users, compared to $1.5 million for PCs and laptops. So there we have it. Let's do a comparison. What does that look like? So there's almost a £300,000 saving to be had here. So this proves it categorically that it is possible, if done properly. You can roll out virtual desktops cheaper than rolling out PCs. Now, if you've done this exercise before and you've come up with a different figure, I could almost guarantee it would be because you've based your calculation on the fact that you'll be going to be running VDI virtual PC desktops. Because when we do the maths on virtual PC desktops, we don't get 200 to 280 users per server. You'd be lucky to get 40 or 50 of the same kit. And secondly, you're more than likely going to budget in a really expensive SAN. So if you're going to run 1,000 users, you're going to have to buy a SAN that will have a disk IOPS in excess of 1 million IOPS. Well, in this calculation, you're going to need a minimum of 100,000 IOPS. So that's not your average SAN, so there'd be a huge cost associated to that too. And if that's the model you've been working from, I can guarantee you that you cannot do that cheaper than rolling out PCs, and your calculation would be correct. But if you do it this way, you run session-based desktops. You make that identical to virtual PC desktops. You design the hardware in such a way that it's been designed specifically for virtual desktops. You work on a model that you're guaranteeing the performance of the solution through the design by making sure that there is enough hardware allocated right down to the individual user. That way, not only are you given a really good user experience, but also you are producing the cheapest desktop that money can buy. And before I move off this slide, there might be some questions like, why Citrix? Why not VMware? Why not just terminal services? I'm just going to say straight away, you can rule out just terminal services. Terminal services is great for many things, but it won't fit everybody. There are a lot of things on terminal services that just do not work. And they include things like USB mics and Teams redirection back down to the client. You're never going to be able to get things like video conferencing on soft phones working on them. So at best, terminal services can be viewed as a tactical solution that maybe will support 70% of your user base. And there's always a risk with terminal services that there may be a strategic decision to make a certain decision on a certain piece of software like Teams, for example, to roll that out globally across your organization that terminal services won't support. So just terminal services alone is too short-sighted, it's tactical, and its user base will erode over a period of time, and you'll end up finding yourself managing not only a complex terminal services environment, but also a PC estate as well. So in effect, you've got the worst of both worlds. Now VMware, I will state that they're not that far behind Citrix, to be honest with you. But to be open and honest with you, the only real difference being is not VMware. It's only the Teradici PC over IP piece that VMware uses that puts it on par with Citrix. And VMware don't own Teradici. They are an independent company. Without PC over IP, VMware has to fall back to RDP, and then you're back with the same challenges with RDP with VMware. And given literally there is a cigarette paper apart in terms of costing, and that is Citrix versus VMware under the right licensing type, I would definitely put my money on Citrix. You saw from the demo earlier that you can have rich media content playing quite nicely in a virtual desktop. With browser content redirection, the HDX media redirection for Skype and Teams, the virtual desktop can be seen absolutely seamless, and if done right, the users won't even know they're using a virtual desktop. If you remove the logos, you remove the Windows logo, you remove the Citrix logo, they forget that they're using a virtual desktop. And let's not forget, a virtual desktop should be far more available than a PC or a laptop. If your PC or laptop breaks, that's it. You have to go and wait till you get a new one. If you're working on virtual desktops and your endpoint breaks, just jump onto any device and you carry on exactly where you left it. It makes security easier, it makes business continuity easier, it makes disaster recovery easier, and it makes remote working easier. And when it comes to compliance, Citrix puts checkboxes in so many compliance boxes. PCI DSS, COCO compliance, very easy with Citrix. So basically, guys, there it is. There you have it. This is how you roll out virtual desktops cheaper than PCs, and this is provable. And if you want reference sites that have done exactly this, then contact me, message me. I will put you in contact with customers that will happily talk to you about the work that we've done for them doing exactly this. And if you have this crazy idea that you think that a virtual desktop is inferior to a PC or a laptop, I want you to think again. I can tell you now, my virtual desktop runs much faster than my laptop. That's the end, guys. We're at the end of this presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time out today, and I hope you found this content useful. If any of you's got any queries or questions, then please just reach out to me and I will get back to you. And just before I go, we're currently offering a limited time offer, reduced price Citrix Health Check. It normally costs £5,000 for a full health check of your current Citrix estate. And during these crazy times, we're offering those for a limited time at £1,500. So again, if that's something that would be of interest to you, please let me know.
And I'll hopefully see you in the next presentation.
Thank you. Goodbye.